everybody, and welcome back to Theology Taco. My name is Tim, and the title of this episode is called Death Blows, which, yes, is a double entendre. And you're in for a treat today or tonight, whenever you're listening to. My wife, Anna, is joining me. She has a master's degree in marriage and family studies. And since we'll be talking about death, I thought this would be a great opportunity to work together. And we're going to be tackling, along with death, we're going to be tackling grief, because the two go hand in hand. And we're going to be talking about some myths of death and grief, and trying to debunk them and provide some better solutions or answers for those myths. So you might be asking, why talk about death? Well, it's October and it's Halloween, and that kind of eerily coincided with this topic. About 6 months ago, I had a friend pass away unexpectedly, and I've spent the last 6 months on an odyssey, so to say, trying to understand death in the light of my faith, and how to develop that understanding into something that can help people who are grieving, or help those who are comforting those who are grieving. So I think we're just gonna jump into it right away. I'd like to introduce to you my wife, Anna. Say hello, Anna.
Hello.
Okay. I'm going to ask her a question. This is going to be like question and response. So, Anna, grief. How could you define grief in an everyday term or definition that makes sense, but is an accurate definition also?
So, I think what's important to note first is that grief isn't exclusive to death. Grief can cover a multitude of topics, from job loss or relationships ending in divorce and just various other things. But for the purpose, obviously, of this podcast, we're going to focus on the idea of death and really how it relates in that sense. Psychology kind of has what I would deem a more impersonal or technical definition, simply by defining grief as conflicting feelings caused by a change in or end of a familiar behavior or pattern in your life. So really, in psychology, it's all about trying to find a new normal after some drastic change has taken place in your normal life, your normal pattern of doing things, that's really causing you to reevaluate, revamp the way you do things. And, in cases of job loss, that might be a little easier than perhaps in the case of the death of a friend, spouse, child, etc.
Oh, so I heard the word feelings. So grief, it's not just one feeling, right?
No, absolutely not. And that's unfortunately a very common mindset, but also a very dangerous one. A lot of people automatically associate grief with sadness, or perhaps even with anger, but in some instances that's just not the way you feel. Perhaps a loved one dies after a long battle with cancer. You may not necessarily feel sad, but perhaps relieved, or there's many circumstances surrounding the way a person may pass away that might not cause sadness to be the first emotion, and it causes people to feel guilty or feel as though they're not grieving properly because they didn't fall into that one category.
So grief is multifaceted, it sounds like. And you mentioned that there's a lot of popular mindsets about grief. So one of the most popular mindsets of grief that I hear a lot is something called the 5 stages of grief, and it mostly revolves around a person's death.
Right. And I know a lot of people, and you'll hear it on TV and books, you hear, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. That's the order you're supposed to go in. That's how it works. And that's just how we do things. Well, I've actually read a book throughout my undergrad by John D. James called The Grief Recovery Handbook, and he brings up a very interesting point that not many people are aware of. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who actually coined those terms, or the 5 stages, never intended for those stages to be identified with grief or death in that sense. Instead, her intention with those 5 stages was to be assigned for individuals who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And throughout time, unfortunately, just kind of a counterpart of it all, it became labeled with death. And this type of mentality makes the grieving process very mechanical, and though that may be comforting to some, those that don't fall into those categories at the specific times, or, perhaps in the right order, often feel they're doing it wrong and feel like they'll never reach that level of acceptance. James, within this book, makes a very valid point that grief isn't about a broken head, it's about a broken heart. We have to fix the heart, and oftentimes that's not as systematic or strategic as perhaps these 5 steps or 5 stages might lead into somebody believing.
I remember when you first told me about that in the book, I was like, what? Yeah. Because it's everywhere. Like I've heard that 5 stages of grief everywhere, and it's about death. Mm-hmm. And then now this book, and you are coming along and saying that's not it. So how the heck do you grieve?
Well, and there's unfortunately not a simple answer for that. One of the big things they teach you throughout, any type of psychological career or degree is that every single relationship is different. Every individual is unique. No one person is going to feel the same thing as another person, and especially not for a given amount of time. What Dr. James was able to discover with his colleagues after years and years of research is that though there was not a specific amount of time allotted or a particular order in which people grieved, there were common, things that they would experience. And some of those that he mentioned throughout this text were, reduced concentration, a sense of numbness, disrupted sleeping or eating patterns or habits, and then roller coasters of emotional energy where people would go from highs to lows very rapidly. But again, the biggest thing is that not everybody would feel all of these emotions, and certainly not for the same length of time. And, maybe not at all. There is no universal standard, no universal tactic to handling grief, just because, once again, everybody is individual and all relationships are unique.
All right. So now that you've said that grief isn't systematic, with that being the case, knowing that we can't just move from one stage of grief to the next, like the 5 stages, what about the individuals who feel like they're stuck or feel like they need to keep on grieving?
So, unfortunately, we see this a lot. The idea that you can't get over the loss or the death of somebody that you cared about. This idea that you're permanently broken, or that this is just something that's impossible to step away from. But you can't let the idea of death or the sadness consume you forever. It is indeed possible to ultimately get over someone without forgetting or without, really having to step away from the situation as a whole. Part of that is what we consider successful grief recovery. Recovery does not mean that you are forgetting. It simply means you are choosing to claim the circumstance instead of it claiming you. You are choosing to remember somebody fondly without it being followed by immense sadness. And you're also, but you're also acknowledging that it is okay to feel sad from time to time, and really ultimately learning to deal with the death directly instead of avoiding it or feeling as though it's a topic that just shouldn't be talked about or handled in general.
Okay, well, do you think that you could give us an example like that we might come across in everyday life?
So one of the best examples I remember reading was in regards to a mother whose daughter had committed suicide. She approached Dr. James and his colleagues and said, my heart is permanently broken. I can't ever move past this. I miss my daughter. And though this is often a very acceptable statement and few people would argue with her, Dr. James and his colleagues kind of pushed back a little bit and said, do you ever have fond memories of your daughter? And the woman naturally said, yes, of course. She would recall her first steps or her prom night, things of that nature. And they continued to ask her how those made her feel. And she said they brought her joy and happiness. And Dr. James continued on and said, part of the mindset of being permanently broken or permanently heartbroken is really damaging to the grieving process, because it puts people in a very victim mindset of not being able to overcome the sadness, not being able to overcome the anger or the depression. And he posits that perhaps we should present it as sometimes when I think about the circumstances of this loved one's death, I feel a little sad. And that actually gives you a lot more freedom to simply enjoy life and to continue to build your life with happiness and joy and help live the legacy of the person who passed on before you.
Well, you kind of already answered the question that I wanted to ask next. I see a lot of movies where people are struggling with grief, the death of a loved one, and they get into some conversation with another major character in the film, and they say, I feel like I'm forgetting them, and if I stop grieving them, I'm gonna forget what they're like. Is that something that's true? Do you start to forget something, or forget somebody once you stop grieving?
I think everybody would agree you don't just forget somebody who's had an impact on your life, regardless of how long they've been gone or what circumstances took them, or anything of that nature. And grieving never necessarily ends. However, you are considered recovered or in a recovery process when you can openly talk about a loved one or share memories in a positive light, and not have it immediately or always, I wouldn't say necessarily immediately, but always followed by a spiral downward into depression and anger and frustration. Being able to live through those fond memories, and maybe even some of the not so fond memories, and laugh about them, or really just embrace them and try to, again, live out the legacy of this person that you cared so much for. And just being able to do that, once again, without that negative spiral following, is when you really hit kind of the peak of recovery when it comes to grief.
Okay.
So, as Tim and I were kind of preparing for this, we talked a little bit about, how do we tie the two in? He's got the theological degrees, I've got psychological, and a lot of our work has coincided in some ways. Some of it's kind of, not exactly. So when we were preparing for this podcast, Tim came up with a good idea to kind of flip the conversation on its head. He asked me some questions from a psychological perspective, and I want to now approach it from more of a theological perspective to see, some questions that, I've wondered myself, and he, will be able to give some light on, and perhaps things that other people have, wondered. So my first question for him was, knowing what we have discussed regarding, healthy grieving processes, do you feel that most Christians do handle grief in a healthy way?
Oh, man. All right. Well, I don't want to make a blanket statement about what every Christian does or doesn't do. I think that a lot of people probably get over their grief in a healthy way. But that being said, there are also a lot of Christians that handle these things in a pretty clumsy way. And I'll give you an example. Have you ever, I don't know, Anna, if you've been to you haven't been to very many funerals, have you?
Thankfully, no.
Well, I have, unfortunately, and sometimes there is a a person who will say, we don't know why God took so-and-so. And sometimes that thought is quickly followed up by the verse from Job, which says, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. But then, if that person is like protested against or pushed for like, well, what the heck are you talking about? That person also might say, well, God's ways are higher than our own ways and we'll never understand. That verse is from Isaiah, by the way. I think that the person is doing their best out of desperation, really, to comfort the grieving. But they're insinuating that God had a reason to take our loved one, even if we don't understand. To me, that is not really comforting. I don't know about you. And these statements of comfort leave out something crucial, and that's mainly the entire New Testament.
So, you say a lot of people will say these things at funerals, and a lot of the speaking done at funerals is often by like church leadership or, for Christians in particular, people within the church. Do you feel like leadership within the church has really been trained properly on how to handle grief as a whole?
I think that it's getting better. I really do. A lot more church leaders are starting to, I don't want to make this sound elitist, but they're really starting to pursue Christian education, and they're really starting to dive deep into the theology of I don't want to say death, but how theology interacts with all of these difficult aspects of life. And we were fortunate enough to, well, I don't want to say fortunate, but we recently went to a funeral where the pastor who presided over the funeral was very educated in how to deal with grief. And she was a, yes, I say she was a pastor, and she was dealt with hospice stuff, so she was very trained and also very sensitive and empathetic. So I think it's getting better, and I see that a lot more and more. The only thing is I don't see that transfer over to the congregation too well. I mean, like everyday Christians,
right? I think a lot more pastors are acknowledging the significance in learning the psychological side of grief as well as the biblical side, and really being able to join the two makes a huge difference when somebody's going through a life-altering thing like the death of a spouse or a child or any other loved one. It's really important that those two things do mix, because it is such a pivotal point in people's lives. And Tim, you also mentioned earlier that the New Testament tends to contradict certain myths, especially, when it comes to like God taking people away. Can you explain a little bit more on exactly what you mean by that?
I can. The death of Christ showed that he paid our debt, and that whoever believes in Christ will have their sin forgiven. But the resurrection shows us that God defeated death, even though the defeat of death hasn't been consummated in this reality yet. Jesus is also seen in much of the New Testament, especially John, in the Gospel of John, that he brings life. He's the author of life. So my question is, why then would God essentially take the life of a person, including those who believe in him and who he calls his children, if the New Testament says that Jesus, aka God, defeated death? That doesn't really make sense to me. And why would he use death if he's at war against death?
Well, exactly. My next question, why? Then why do we experience death? Because the reality is death is a part of our everyday life. Nobody avoids the reality of death. So why do we experience death if Christ has indeed defeated it?
Right. And so I mentioned that the defeat of death hasn't been consummated. Christ defeated death. He was resurrected, showing why, he's the Messiah. But we still experience death for a few reasons. And one of the reasons is because the author of Hebrews mentions that Satan holds the power of death. Now, when I talk about Satan, I'm not talking about the red guy with two pointy horns and a pitchfork. I'm talking about the biblical adversary that spiritually works against the plan and will of God. So he uses death as a means to induce fear, steal joy, and draw people further away from God. He steals, kills, and destroys.
So ultimately, it's a ploy of the enemy of sorts.
And another, if I could add one more, another reason why we experience death, it isn't exactly a negative. The Bible doesn't always speak of death negatively, even though it's essentially an enemy of God. But we experience death because it helps us remember that we're not immortal. We have to make the time that we have worthwhile, I guess. Yeah. You know, we only have a certain amount of time, and in that time we need to be
kind of fulfilling our purpose.
Yeah, right. That's a good way to put it.
That makes sense. So a lot of people still, even knowing that God has defeated death, are very fearful of the idea of death. Is that something that should or shouldn't be the case? It's kind of hard to tell somebody not to be afraid of dying, or of death.
Now we're getting into some preachy categories here, because you believe in Christ. Your eternity is ultimately wrapped up in Christ. So you don't need to fear death and its eternal ramifications. Mm-hmm. But I understand if people might fear the process of dying, because honestly, I am not looking forward to the process of dying.
Sounds kind of painful.
I think if everybody had one way that they wish they died, it would be peacefully in their sleep. But that's just not the reality of it. So,
or even perhaps the circumstances around another person's death.
Yeah,
I think is more what is feared. How do you go on afterwards? Or
a lot of it is the fear of the unknown. But
right, I think that's where it lies in everything. Nobody likes to not know what's going to happen, especially with something so final. But I think Tim can even attest to this too. The bigger picture of this is that we serve a God who's bigger than that fear, or bigger than the depression or the anxiety that may come along with the thoughts of death. So though we don't have to necessarily fear our eternal resting place as Christians, it's still very natural to be, fearful and a little anxious when it comes to the circumstances surrounding, your death or the death of, loved ones. We certainly would never state that you should just pretend like it didn't happen or it won't happen. That's obviously not wise, and it's hard to not, nobody ever thinks of death joyfully, or at least I don't know anybody that thinks of it and, looks forward to the idea.
Well, as far as the process of dying goes, I don't think anybody looks forward joyfully to it, but I mean, if we're talking about death as in our eternal resting place, I look forward to the
There's some peace in knowing where you're...
To the peace that we'll have.
Right. I think that's a very fair assessment. And I know we talked a little bit about, the idea of Christians and how they handle it, and, maybe not correctly. How should they handle death? How should Christians approach death or grieving in that sense?
Well, let's talk about grieving. One of my favorite verses, and it's very popular, of course, but it's very important. It's a very important verse, is Romans 8:28. I'm going to read that now from my NIV translation, which I know some of you might be cringing at right now, Eli. But it goes, and we know that in all things God works for those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That's essentially God turning a really, really, really crappy thing like death into something beautiful. And when I interpret that in the context of grieving, it's okay to grieve. I think you should grieve. And if you're a person who's trying to comfort them, a person who's grieving, don't be like Job's friends and try to insist on a reason for another person's death, this or that. I think that you just need to be there for that person and listen to them, and don't try to offer answers, but just be an active listener, be a shoulder to cry on. And then, but being in the process of grief, when I look at that verse, it shows me, or reminds me, that nothing we face can ever be too big for God to transform into something wonderful.
Right.
And I've been through that a few times.
Mm-hmm.
But it requires patience, and it requires trust in God.
I think that's a valid point. And I want to add two things. One, from more of a psychological perspective, where Tim mentioned that, trying to offer answers or trying to justify or reason away somebody's feelings. In psychology, that's a big no-no. You never want to try to argue away or explain away the emotions of another person, especially in the time of grief. You don't ever want to say, oh, you should be over that by now. It's been months. Or, surely you can just move on, or this happened for that reason, or whatever the case may be. People just want to be heard. Or perhaps they don't want to be heard at all, and they just want to sit and they want to, sulk for a little while. And that's quite all right. There's nothing wrong with experiencing grief. But also, to Tim's point about the verse in Romans and working things together for the good, we recently watched the movie Wonder. And a big point that our pastor made throughout that film was there was a scene, where the family had kind of been in a little bit of turmoil and frustration with each other. There was a lot of arguing and discord. And you seen the moment that unified the family the most was when their family pet passed away. I know a pet dying may not be a big deal to some, but in many households that's a huge deal. And this is something that rocked them to their core, and it caused what, seemingly was a very dark situation and a very sad situation, brought cohesion to this family and allowed them to kind of band back together and face what life had in store for them going forward. So it's just the idea that death, yes, may be bad in some senses, but that doesn't mean that God is incapable of really flipping it on its head and saying, okay, this might have started out bad, but let me show you what I'm going to do next. Let me show you how I'm going to work with you to build on this and how you're going to grow from it. So, you have anything else before I move on?
I'm curious to know what your next question is, actually.
Okay. So when it comes to those proper ideas, so to speak, or the common themes or experiences with people who are grieving, like the sense of numbness, the emotional roller coasters of emotions, do you feel like that also applies to Christians, or is that, just the non-Christian population?
No, especially the feeling of numbness. I think there's a spiritual correlation with that. And I remember when our mutual friend passed away, you came in and you told me, and like I experienced this completely, like, I don't know how to categorize it other than this like existential like terror.
Right. Kind of feel like you've been removed from
like
everything.
There was just like this weird like alien feeling, like this can't be true.
Right.
And I think it's because it feels alien. It feels so weird because death was not part of God's plan for the human population.
Right.
Death was never a part of God's plan for creation.
Right.
So it's like it's this invader that comes into our lives, and we feel it on the spiritual level, especially when it comes to an unexpected death of a loved one. And I remember Greg Boyd, who is a theologian and pastor in Minnesota of my former church. He spoke about death like a week after, or not even a week, but like
I think it was that following Sunday.
A few days within our friend's death, and he brings that up, and that's why I spoke about the passage in Hebrews where it's Satan that holds the power of death, because it was brought in when sin was brought into the world, and those two things were never supposed to be a part of creation. So that's why I think we feel this numbness that we have when a person close to us dies and when we're grieving.
Yeah, and I think outside of the numbness, the other things I've seen multiple times, though I have never thankfully lost anybody extremely close to myself, but the idea of change in sleeping patterns or eating, those things I've witnessed multiple times, but especially the roller coaster of emotional energy. I recall when Tim's father passed away just before our wedding, he would kind of go through highs and lows where, one night he would be up for, 10 hours working on a slideshow, and the next day he was just completely drained, and it's this idea that you go from one high to low, and I don't think that that's exclusive to Christians or non-Christians. It's a very universal thing that may have a bit of an ebb and flow. You'll feel some things, maybe not others, but being a Christian doesn't necessarily make you immune to the experiences that come along with grieving or with death.
Oh gosh, no. And in fact, we see that in the Bible, again, in John, with Jesus. Even Jesus. Okay, here I go.
Good old Jesus. Go ahead.
I'm going with this. In Psalms, I think it's Psalm 36, we read that God is close to the crushed in spirit. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the Israelites, the Jews, read those Psalms. And then we get Jesus, fully God, fully man, and his friend Lazarus dies. And he weeps.
Right.
So all of these people who are mourning Lazarus see Jesus weeping over the death of his friend.
Right.
This is God grieving. So all of these people get to, even though they might not be aware of it at the time, they get to see God physically grieving through Jesus Christ.
Right.
So, what was your question?
No, I mean that brings up a valid point. That Christians aren't immune to.
No, yes,
they're not immune to the idea, and I think that kind of brings us to one of our next points about really the importance of grieving, not necessarily just grieving alone, but kind of the significance of doing it within community. One of the biggest hurdles or delays in the grieving process is this idea of isolation or a feeling of isolation. The idea that there's nobody that can help you, nobody's going to understand, nobody's going to be able to make you feel better. And though that may be true, nobody's going to be able to make you feel better and nobody may actually understand. There's really value in joining hands with the person next to you and really trying to embrace the help that is being given in the sense of community, because the last thing you want to do is isolate yourself. And I know Tim is itching to add something to this,
yes,
so I'm going to let him.
Because there's a very powerful dynamic taking place there. the way that, Satan uses death is very much to isolate, separate.
Mm-hmm.
And we've unfortunately have seen this recently in national events. We had the shooter of the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. He went in and said all Jews must die or something like that. Death was using the enemy was using death to separate.
Right.
We saw it again with that guy mailing bombs to all of Trump's critics, again to cause separation.
Mm-hmm.
So enemy wants to separate, isolate.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the church is extremely important, because the church is community. That's the community that we need to go to in order to get support. We as the church should be supporting so that those who are grieving don't feel isolated. They don't get separated from humanity.
Right.
They don't get separated from God.
Well, because it's arguable that death is probably the biggest turning point for people in their faith. It either draws them closer to God or it pulls them away. It has such power, and like Tim said, that's one of the biggest ploys of the enemy. He knows death, with it being as final as it is and as isolating as it can feel, that it's got some intense power. And knowing the God that you serve, or knowing your congregation, your community, and being embedded in something like that can make a drastic difference. It's by no means going to make the process easy, but it'll help you see the other side of it. It'll help you get to the other side of it, perhaps a little bit easier than if you were continuing to do this alone. A lot of people will get stuck, like we were talking about before, trying to handle it on their own, because it's a very complicated process to walk through, especially if you don't have somebody walking beside you. So it's, again, just kind of focuses on that importance of community and the idea that, unfortunately a lot of people aren't trained in how to handle grief. They're not trained in how to handle death. And I have seen a lot lately that that's an issue that churches are addressing. They're building teams that specialize in these areas and that can really walk alongside somebody who is struggling.
Yeah, I think one of them is called the Stephen Ministry.
The church we used to attend had a Stephen Ministry that really helped people through crisis. And I think that makes a huge, huge difference, not only having somebody trained with the proper psychological protocol, but also the biblical backing that's going to help them see, maybe God's plan or purpose, if it is to be seen, or, help them also understand that they are still human. We're not God. We're not, meant to know everything, and we're not going to always understand why things happen, but to simply trust and to have faith and to know that, there is light after the darkness. Mm-hmm. There will be something coming of this. And I think part of what I wanted to make clear with this is that Tim and I are well aware that this isn't a black and white kind of issue. This isn't a topic we could cover in probably 12 podcasts, at least not to its fullest extent. Death is a hefty topic. Honestly, when he told me he wanted to do this, I kind of thought he was a little crazy. I said people are going to cringe, when they hear this, but like he said, over the last 6 months, it's become a bit of an odyssey of sorts, and it's one I sort of sat alongside and watched for a little while, and then I'm like, okay, maybe there is a little bit more to this, and I started to reread one of the textbooks, the Grief Recovery Handbook, and really see the importance of educating people. It's one of those topics that people don't like to talk about, but unfortunately everybody experiences. So I think he and myself just want to make it known that we're not claiming to be experts. We're not claiming to have all of the answers, but that our goal is ultimately to help whoever we can with the information we are providing.
Right, and I think you hit the nail on the head with educating. Well, before our friend's death, I had written this blog about death in I think it was in December 2016, because that's when Prince died, and also
it's like the year of deaths, wasn't it? Like every famous person.
Carrie Fisher, who played Princess Leia, and this just shocked everybody that these people
celebrities could die,
could die. Unfortunately, everybody dies, even these
rich and
beloved
famous,
people. Right? I mean, these people are important. They were important to people, I guess.
You can't buy your way out of death.
No, and so I was like, well, of course they're gonna die. Everybody dies. And then I wrote this blog, which I can only now consider as something that's cute, because there were good intentions, but there were also a lot of ready-made answers. And ready-made answers are something that really only scratch the surface. They're superficial. And unfortunately, they don't handle nuance. But there's something about experience. When you experience the tragic death of someone you care about, it makes you reconsider what you know, and it makes you want to investigate, well, what's really going on. Mm-hmm. And although I don't claim to have all the answers, what I did want to do was try to reevaluate what I know into something that was more faithful to the message of Christ, and something that we could apply to the Christian faith, into something that isn't just superficial, but that really explores the grayer areas, or the things that we don't necessarily want to look at, but that we need to understand. So again, it's faith seeking understanding.
Right. When I think it's important to note, he mentions his blog. It's not that he hadn't experienced death for himself.
Right.
Prior to that, he lost his father, and for many people, that's a very life-altering event, and he was no exception to that. However, there's a difference, even though it might be heartbreaking in losing a parent, who has been ill, compared to losing a friend at a very young age in a more tragic way. And I think that's what he said. It's easy to give the ready-made answers when the situation fits, but oftentimes, or even more often than not, the situation doesn't fit. Mm-hmm. And the ready-made answers can often be more damaging than they are helpful.
Yeah.
And it's, okay, again, it goes back to that whole idea that, okay, well, I'm not grieving that way. That doesn't make sense to me, and I've heard that 100 times, so there's something wrong with me. I'm not in denial, so I must be doing this wrong. I'm not angry, so I must be doing this wrong. What am I missing? Am I the broken one? And the reality is that's just not the case, because like he said, or like I mentioned earlier, everybody's unique. Every situation is unique, and the nuances really matter. And that's why, this podcast may be helpful to some, and others may go, I need more information, or what about, my particular situation where X, Y, and Z occurred? And our answers might shift a little bit, but I think the message will remain the same for the most of it. But there may be additional information that we can find for you, or, there might be times where we just say, look, we don't know. We don't understand why certain things happen. We can't give you an explanation. And I think that's where faith really comes into play, to just acknowledge that sometimes we're going to have to deal with the unknown. We're going to have to deal with not understanding and not necessarily having the right kind of answer to give. And that's hard as somebody whose goal is to be a therapist and really help people walk through things like this. I want to be able to provide those kind of answers, or that kind of peace and conclusion of sorts. But it's also part of what they train you to know is that that's just not always the reality. And people have to, that's where faith, or for me, faith comes into play. And just acknowledging that that's something we have to rely on that's bigger than ourselves.
That's very well put. So, I think we can pretty much wrap it up. I want a few takeaways. In my best research, I want to tell you with the conclusion that I don't believe it's biblically accurate to say that God will kill your loved ones. He'll just, he doesn't need a flower for his garden, so he's not going to take your kid like that.
doesn't need a new angel.
Doesn't need and that's another thing. We don't become angels when we die.
That's a whole nother story.
Yeah, that's another podcast. I don't think he's not out to kill your loved one. And
a loving God doesn't cause pain.
No, I don't think so.
He's not gonna.
I'm gonna go off into like 50 different subjects, and also, again, I can't. Romans 8:28 is just like, it's a simple verse, and it kind of like, when you take the time, when you are patient and you trust God, you can start to see, or you're receptive to see what God is doing with that pain and how he's weaving it into something that is beautiful, something that he makes good things come out of bad, because that's just what he does.
It's kind of that cheesy saying, you can't have a message without the mess. God's going to take something so terrible looking and he's going to create a beautiful testimony out of it in the end, if you just continue to be faithful and you continue to be patient and you see it through. Don't give up, don't quit because you feel like there's no light at the end of that tunnel.
When our friend died, it didn't take too much time. It took a week or so, but we, like, the community in which she lived in and her friends all around the country, we raised $50,000. I think it was, or pretty close to that.
That was just on one fundraiser.
On one fundraiser, yeah. we raised $50,000, and then people also donated a whole bunch of stuff to her family, and that to me is beautiful.
It is.
To me, that's proof of this verse.
It's God taking something that could have completely destroyed her husband and her kids, or the community, and wrecked it, but instead he used that to band people together, to reunite friends who probably hadn't spoken in decades, to really bring a community together, a family together of people to say, look, yes, this is terrible, we're heartbroken, but we're going to fight through this, and we're going to come out for the better, and we're going to make sure her husband and her kids are cared for. And I think that, like Tim said, is very much so proof of God working in these situations. And I don't think, anybody could really deny that. I don't consider coincidences to be a thing. I think God knew that this was something, in this particular instance, as in many, that was going to rock people. It was going to shock them. It was going to, really have that factor that the enemy wanted, that, was going to make people doubt. So instead, he turned it around, and he planted the seeds for these fundraisers and for these events that really just, once again, brought so many people together. You've seen, dozens and dozens and dozens of people just, joining hands, with another complete stranger because they knew this one individual. And that's very powerful. That says a lot about the way that the Holy Spirit works, and the way that, there can be some life, or not necessarily joy, but there's some good that can come out of these seemingly terrible situations.
Yeah.
So,
all right, I think we're gonna wrap it up here. I appreciate you tuning in. This is a very heavy subject, and I hope that you learned something. And I know that I learned a whole bunch just in preparing this, and in the last 6 months. And if you need to reach out to us, you can email theologytaco@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to provide you with resources if they're coming from us, or we'll point you to maybe somebody or some organization that can help you. And in the next podcast is going to be about the incarnation of Christ, since we're closing in on the holiday season. So once again, I just want to thank you for tuning in, and God bless.